Está con nosotros Anton Brender, economista jefe de Candriam. Good morning, Anton.
Good morning. Sorry, I can speak only in English.
What do you explain the inflation number that we know yesterday?
In the US?
Yeah.
Well, I think you have to keep in mind that what we're going through right now is something totally unseen. If you look at the speed of the rebound in activities that took place in the US in particular over the last months, it's something totally new. So what is happening right now has to be reinterpreted, against that background. Many things now are in shortage if you just look at semiconductors, which means that car production has been curbed. Used cars have been the key driver of US inflation. This has been said often, but you can understand this only if you take into account this very exceptional situation in which, on one hand, the manufacturing sector had to respond very quickly to a surge in demand. Durable goods demand in the US jumped by 30% at least compared to what it was a year ago. That's a huge jump in production, and at the same time, you have dislocations in supply chains. Containers was missing at some moment. Semiconductors, I've said, are missing right now even. So if you take all those things together, a surge in demand, a very quick rebound in activity, dislocation in supply chains, it's understandable that you have very, very peculiar evolutions. That's one of the factors I think you have to insist on. The second factor is also that many sectors, provided deflationary forces. That is, you had a fall in accommodation prices, hotels, restaurants, and so on. Those things now are picking up again. So if you take those two things, some sectors are under pressure of demand, some others are just catching up with past falls. It explains that inflation is jumping in the US. So should we worry, and how long will it last? Well, we tend to believe that it won't last too long, but it will last at least a few months. And the other thing you have to take into account is that the attitude of the Fed towards inflation has also changed. Even before the pandemic, the Fed wanted to accept slightly more inflation than it used in the past. So those two things taken together lead us to believe that there is an upsurge in inflation, inflation will stay above 3%, if you look at the CPI, for a while, and then we believe it will decelerate. That's our bet. It's temporary, but temporary can mean a few months, and markets may get a bit nervous when they see those numbers.
And what do you see this is the comparison with United States and Europe in inflation, when you see that European Central Bank yesterday talked about 2%, but with a slow growth from the European area. What's the difference, and what's the most important point from Europe before to understand that the inflation in Europe, tourism is not in the strong pace, and what's the comparison with Europe and United States?
Well, the comparison, first you have, again, to take one thing into account. In the US, the boost to purchasing power has been huge. If you look at household disposable income in the US, it has increased much more because of the checks and the increase in unemployment benefits and so on. Household disposable income in the US has increased more than it would have without the pandemic. This is something, again, totally unseen. So the surge in demand is stronger in the US. In Europe, we tried to keep income rather stable, and we almost achieved it, but still, it didn't increase faster than it did before. That the pressure of demand is much weaker in Europe. So it's understandable that Christine Lagarde says, I'm not worried, and we're not worried at all about inflation in Europe. It's weak. And as you mentioned, tourism is a very important factor because that's where all the depression in demand took place. And the big question is, are we going to see a pickup in travel, at least with Europe in the coming months, especially in summers? That's one of the key questions. And some countries, I'm thinking of Spain, of Portugal, of Greece, are very dependent on a rebounded travel. And if you look at inflation across countries in Europe, what do we see? We see that inflation is slightly above average. I mean, above its past trend in Germany or in Austria, but it's well below in Greece. It's rather very weak in Greece, and Spain has also, as you know, a very low rate of inflation. And I believe that the role of the demand of tourists is very important in that respect. So what is going to happen to tourism, to travel during summer, is going to be key to what's going on in Europe, at least in the southern part of Europe this year, and also for how inflation evolves. But we're not worried at all about inflationary pressures in Europe.
And tapering, what's your point of view after we know this European Central Bank decision and 5% inflation in the US, tapering could be at least at the end of the year?
This year? No, I think, you mean in the US or in Europe?
In both countries.
In both. Well, in any case, it's going to be sooner in the US than in Europe, I think, because two economies, you know, are in very different situations. One good news still that we didn't talk about, that is very important also, is that fiscal policy in Europe has been very reasonable. That's a key difference between what happened 10 years ago and now. And of course, there is much more fiscal support, at least less fiscal restriction in Europe. In 2021, fiscal policy is going to keep supporting activity in Europe, and that's a very good thing. Now, tapering in Europe, I think, is going to take place at best, you know, next year. In the US, it may start, at least talks will start, we believe, in July, and or possibly June, we're not sure, but there is no emergency. And we think that this will take place in Europe much later than in the US.
Thank you very much, Anton Brender, Economista Jefe de Candriam. Good day, good business.
Thanks, my pleasure.